They will have absolutely everything that there is, every piece of paper, every photograph, every bit of physical evidence.
A grand jury has begun hearing evidence in the police-related death of 18-year-old Michael Brown. As we know, the unarmed black teenager died after being shot 6 times by Ferguson, Missouri police officer Darren Wilson. We know what's played out since then. You've had riots, protests in that town, and they've continued for more than a week now as people demand justice. But what justice is somewhat depending on the eye of the beholder, I suppose. Now, the protesters are calling for Wilson's arrest. However, the county prosecutor says it could take until mid-October to determine whether, in fact, Wilson will be charged with any crime. Union officials representing Officer Wilson say politicians and protesters have been far too quick to judge Mr. Wilson. Now, let's bring in our legal panel to get into this and much more. Mayo Bartlett, familiar face here, attorney, former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County DA's office. He's got an interesting perspective on this one. Bill Aronwald, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor himself. Aronwald and Pickett, now in White Plains. Maria Valentine, immigration attorney and chair of the Lower Hudson Valley Chamber of the New York Civil Liberties Union. And Dan Shore, Dan's former Yonkers Inspector General and criminal prosecutor of the Westchester County DA's office, as well as in New York City, specializing in prosecution of domestic violence, sex crimes, abuses, and homicides. Okay, you guys have all worn hats here on both sides of this, and May, I'm going to start with you. Before I get to Eric Holder, what should the public's expectation be with obviously the American spotlight on this case for folks who say, well, guy didn't have a weapon, 6 shots fired. It's not nearly as open and shut as that is.
No, not at all. And 6 shots fired alone doesn't mean very much. Even the autopsy results that we have right now don't tell the full story. They're just pieces of a much larger puzzle. And really, you need to get all of the information. They're conflicting accounts. I think that it's probably even premature to put the matter in the grand jury at this point. There have to be witnesses that haven't been heard from. If I was the prosecutor, I'd want to canvass the area, because the objective here should be to find the truth. That should be the only objective, and we were prosecutors, it was only, just truth and justice. Yep. So if you can go out and find out whether this shooting appears to be justified, that's the most important thing. And that may mean, if you believe it was, that you don't even impanel a grand jury, because I don't think a grand jury should just be played with, and it shouldn't be a waste of time as a formality. On the other hand, if you believe that there were criminal acts committed by this officer, you should prosecute that officer as you would any other person in the community.
Bill, prosecutors got a difficult job as it is, but now you got the U.S. Attorney General who came into Missouri today for more than a photo op, one would think, okay? In fact, the pending op-ed piece in the paper of record in the town. What is Mr. Holder looking to do here, and how does civil rights infringements play into, if not even complicate this case, where you could have potentially competing investigations simultaneously?
Well, I think Holder's presence in Ferguson served multiple objectives. Number one, what it does is it sends a message to the community that the federal government is looking at this, the Department of Justice is interested in it. They're not just going to, let the local law enforcement handle it. It serves a second objective in that it sends a message to the local prosecutor that if you don't do the job the way you're supposed to do it, if you don't do a balanced, fair presentation and investigation, we're going to come in and we'll do it.
So it's not concurrently. One is just a hammer. If you don't do it the right way, I'm coming on top.
But I disagree with something that Mayo said, and that is that I think it was a good idea to put this case into a grand jury right away, because you've got a very restless community there. They're reacting. There were rioting. There's protesting. I think what it does is sort of quells the emotions a little bit if the public is assured that something is being done by law enforcement. It's in a grand jury. Witnesses are being called. Evidence is being presented. And so I think from that point of view, I'm hoping that with the grand jury investigation moving forward, that'll quiet things down.
There is a risk, though, of inflated expectations, right?
There's a risk of inflated expectations, and there's also a risk of trampling on the rights of the accused. So at the end of the day, you don't want to go into a grand jury without having all the information, because you don't want to have wrongful convictions simply to quell the opinion of the community.
Dan, you've been involved in, for me, it's not judgment, but at the end of the day, is there a clear line what is or is not justifiable use of force by a police officer? We're hearing from the union that the guy's got significant facial injuries, that he was giving away 50, 60 pounds to a guy who didn't listen to orders. We don't know what happened right now. But Is there a clear line as to how many times you're allowed to shoot? Does it matter if the guy was armed or not? When is there a justifiable shooting by police? Is this discretionary or more clear?
Well, there are guidelines for when force can be used and how much force can be used, but these are all factors that need to be taken, and then you look at the totality of the circumstances. Whether the person was armed or not is a factor in whether you can use deadly force, but it's not the only factor, because sometimes an unarmed person can pose a big physical risk to you as a police officer. So we don't know all the facts. What we were talking about before about the grand jury and the state versus the federal government, I think it's important to note the federal government, they're not investigating a murder case or a manslaughter case. They don't have the jurisdiction to investigate those type of crimes. They're going to look at civil rights violations, and they would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this officer was motivated based on race. That's a really tough case for them to make. Now, maybe they can, and maybe witnesses will hear something that's relevant to that, but that's a different type of crime and a harder crime to prove than what the state may be investigating, depending on what evidence they have. So people who are hoping the federal government's going to come in with a murder prosecution, they're going to be very disappointed.
Now, Maria, to the casual observer, somebody sitting at home and they see this thing play out, they say, all right, you got a community that's 2/3 black. You got a police force that's almost 100% white. At least the facts on the ground where the guy didn't have a gun, he got shot 6 times and is dead on the street, sure doesn't look right. But how does one, in the law at least, interpret what was in Officer Wilson's head, where he treated that young man differently because he was black than if he was white? How do we inject race into a situation when we don't even know exactly what even happened?
Right. Well, I think perhaps instead of thinking of it in terms of how do we inject race, how do we dissect race from what was on his mind, right? It is very difficult to show that, to prove that. In the end, we're going to have to gather the evidence, get testimony from him as to what happened, look at what happened. You know, you can't really prove racial motivation unless he comes out and says something. Yeah. Unless there's a pattern. Has he been in other incidences before? You know, look at the police department as a whole, and I think that that's why the consideration of actually looking at the practices of the Ferguson Police Department are important as well.
Real quickly, guys, in terms of jurisdiction for this, can you actually try this case in Ferguson? I mean, it is rioting every night here for the better part of a week, or whatever you want to call it. Can the guy get a fair shot when everybody's making a national statement on where we are in race relations because of the incident he was involved in?
He may get a very fair shot there, because one of the other issues in Ferguson is that I believe that although it's 67% African American, only 12% vote. So you get your jurors off of the voter rolls. Right. So you may not have an African American jury there. But going back to your question very quickly.
I didn't realize that.
But it shouldn't be an issue of race there either, because the question really is whether the officer used excessive force. It shouldn't matter whether it's against me or you. The point is, if there's no need for force to be used, that's the primary question.
Then it's wrong.
Yeah.
All right.
But I think that points to the problem itself too, the fact that you have such low participation among the African American community in Ferguson, and you know, that plays out in terms of education, in terms of who the police officers are, who's on the jury, who the representatives are in terms of the district attorney's office, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
When we go to a break, we're going to switch gears, but we're going to bring this closer to home, because this weekend, New York is going to be dealing with its own race-related, or at least race-perceived related event that happened on Staten Island. Eric Garner, we all know the story, you all have seen the video here. Once again, it will be in the public eye here. We're going to talk about where that case goes from here and how, if in any way, what's going on in Ferguson, Missouri may be impacting that as well. Stay with us.